Good evening and welcome into this space. We're excited that you are with us. If you would like to enter your name into the chat and what you do, that would be wonderful. Make sure that your microphones remain on mute. And at the end of our session, we will have a time for questions. So please, have your questions ready there at the end. Welcome to all who are entering this space. Make sure our microphones are on mute. And in the chat, thank you to those of you who are sharing your name, what you do. We appreciate you being here, and we will have a question and answer portion at the end of our presentation. Welcome to those of you who are entering the space. We really appreciate you being here. As you enter, go ahead and make sure that your microphones are on mute. And in the chat, please share your name and what you do. And at the end of our presentation, we will have an opportunity for questions to each of our presenters. So thank you once again for being here and making sure that our microphones are on mute. Welcome again, and we've got a couple more folks in our waiting room, so we're just letting them into the space. If you haven't already done so, make sure that your microphones are muted. And please introduce yourself in the chat, your name, what you do. And we appreciate all of you being here for our discussion this evening. There will be a question and answer portion at the end. So we do want to be mindful of your time. So I'll go ahead and start. So thank you for coming to our webinar this evening. What is May Day? I am Carla Okuchi. I'm a music teacher at Terra Center Elementary School here in Fairfax County. And I also serve as the Vice President of the Fairfax Education Association, an affiliate of the Virginia Education Association and our largest labor union here in the US, the National Education Association. And I'm thrilled to facilitate this session tonight. We've got some excellent guest speakers to share with us the significance of May Day and how it connects to our labor movement. So our first guest speaker is David Bishop. He is a librarian worker in Arlington County Public Libraries. and he has worked in the library system for almost 15 years, and he is a native of Queens, New York. So welcome, David. Can you share with us just where or how did May Day come to pass? I'm going to give it over to you, David.
Thank you, Carla. What we know as May Day, or what's called the Haymarket Incident, occurred on May 4th, 1886. And really, it's a culmination of labor strife between workers and business during the latter half of the 19th century, just after the Civil War, what we consider to be the Gilded Age, or what we call the Gilded Age. Everyone knows as the Gilded Age. And during that time, the United States was going through a period of rapid industrialization, especially within the railroad industry. It was a burgeoning industry and a lot of speculation, a lot of business with that. So in order to really understand May Day, we really need to understand, I guess, what led up to it, the decades before the actual May Day incident. So I'd like to basically divide my talk into four parts. One, the background of the labor movement from about 1877 to 1886. Two, the events just prior to May 4th of 1886, that event. And also the actual May 4th clash with police. And the last, sort of just a short summary of the trial of the anarchists who were involved with the clash with police on May 4th. Okay, so the labor movement background. To really understand, like I said, really understand the Haymarket incident or tragedy, you really need to understand the culmination of a long series of disputes between labor and management that began with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Before the strike, the US had been going through a depression called the Panic of 1873. So we kind of think of in our own contemporary world, these kind of recessions, and well, that's the same sort of things that happened in the 19th century. They called them panics. So this one panic was in 1873, and it lasted for about 4 years, 1873 to 1877. And it was caused mainly by speculation in railroad investments and overexpansion. So basically too much growth. Everybody was putting their money into the railroad industry and speculating on it. So because of the depression, the railroads like B&O announced a 10% cut in wages. So you'd imagine what that would do, to the working people. Strikes broke out throughout the country, all throughout the country, until President Hayes had to bring in the federal troops to suppress the strikes. So basically, you're talking about a nationwide strikes, a lot of activity, which is pretty amazing for that time. So the aftermath of the strike precipitated an explosive growth in labor militancy, especially within socialist and anarchist circles. Before this, the US was considered exceptional. We've heard that the US being exceptional. Well, this is the same case here. They were considered, it was considered exceptional because there wasn't any large labor strife before this period. So it's really important for American history. So workers during what we know as the Gilded Age became more and more radicalized. In this environment, socialist and anarchist ideas grew, and many workers became active. During 1883 to 1886, there was another depression, which precipitated another upsurge in labor activism. And the rallying cry for workers was the idea of the 8-hour workday. That was very important in this period of time. Labor leaders like Samuel Gompers, I've heard of, in school you hear Samuel Gompers, declared that basically he said 8 hours shall constitute a legal day's labor from and after May 1st, 1886. So that was when they wanted to start the 8-hour workday, May 1st, 1886. So the demand for the 8-hour workday was essentially what sparked the events of Haymarket. that was the proximate reason for it. Of course, as I said before, there were all those other years before where there was a lot more labor strife that also kind of built up to this point. Okay, so now we have sort of the background of what was going on, in the 1870s, 1880s, during the Gilded Age. So what are really the events that led up to what some people call the riot of May 4th, or the incident? I don't consider it a riot, but everyone can dispute that, how you want to really term it, what actually happened on May 4th. So basically, the demand for the 8-hour workday was at first supported by more moderate and mainstream labor factions like Samuel Gompers. And this was initially rejected by more radical elements like the anarchists and the socialists, who were actually very intimately involved in the labor movement at this point, socialist and anarchist. So anarchists like Albert Parsons at first believed that the demand for the 8-hour workday was too reformist. And anarchists wanted to bring down what they called the wage slavery system. They weren't happy with the reforms. They wanted the whole system to be completely rehauled. But eventually the anarchists came to support the 8-hour workday demand because workers were stirred by the thought. Workers really loved this idea. Employers, of course, were bitterly opposed to the idea. And the anarchists saw employers as a class enemy and wanted to side with workers. So they basically supported the 8-hour workday. So it was a very united front of people, all different types of people. And Chicago became the focal point of the 8-hour crusade. And on April 25th, 1886, the Central Labor Union staged an 8-hour demonstration. 25,000 people were addressed by anarchists, Albert Parsons and August Spies. And the buildup to May 1st was substantial. So there was a buildup to the May 1st call for the 8-hour workday. On May 1st, more than 300,000 workers laid down their tools in 13,000 establishments throughout the country. So you can imagine this is a massive amount of just worker activity, activism here and strikes. And the anarchists were at the forefront of the movement at this point. Anarchist Albert Parsons and August Spies were the household names at this time. So the radical fringes, basically, they were really, I shouldn't say fringes, they were really part of this, intimately part of this movement. And they were really the big names in this struggle. So the next few days passed without incident until the afternoon of May 3rd. So basically, May 1st, May 2nd, nothing really happened of consequence in terms of violence. It was very peaceful. But on May 3rd, a bloody encounter occurred at the McCormick Reaper Works, a plant with a history of labor disputes. So this has a long history of labor disputes here, this particular plant. And there was a lockout at the plant and scabs were brought in. A clash ensued between the strikers and the scabs, and a battle broke out between the police and the strikers. Many workers were injured and 2 workers died. So that was on May 3rd. This is what really led up to the actual May 4th incident. Everybody was really angry about what had happened on May 3rd. So an anarchist newspaper drafted a leaflet, and it was called the Revenge Circular, calling for workers to come to a meeting on May 4th at 7:30 at Haymarket Square and take up arms against the police. Some of the anarchists didn't really want that circular to say that, so there was a dispute about whether or not they did try to at one point edit the circular, but they still got out. So there's a big dispute about whether or not the true intentions of that circular, but that's another story. Okay, so here we are at May 4th. There's a rally that's being called on May 4th at 7:30 at Haymarket Square. And basically it started at 8:15. The anarchist August Spies, Albert Parsons, and Samuel Fielding spoke to a crowd of perhaps 3,000 people. They wanted a lot more, so they were a little bit unhappy with the crowd. They thought they were going to get like 20, 30,000 people. They only got really 3,000 people really were there. That's about it. The mayor of Chicago was in the crowd. He left early because he believed the rally was harmless. So he didn't think there was anything really incendiary about what the anarchists were actually saying. But there was a policeman, an Inspector Bonfield in the crowd, who reported to his superiors that Samuel Fielding, who was the last speaker, was using inflammatory language. Now, I want to read to you what Fielding actually said, and whether or not this is really the crux of what happened, whether or not it was inflammatory language or not. So this is what Fielding said. "You have nothing more to do with the law except to lay hands on it and throttle it until it makes last kick. It turns your brothers out on the wayside and has degraded them until they have lost the last vestige of humanity. And they were mere things and animals. Keep your eye upon it, throttle it, kill it, stab it, everything you can do to wound it, to impede its progress." So that was considered by Inspector Bonfield as inflammatory language. Now there's another passage here too that basically sort of the same thing. And that policeman interpreted that as inflammatory. Whether or not it was inflammatory, that's been of course a heated debate, whether or not it was. But it must be said that the actual mayor of Chicago, he went home basically. He decided it wasn't an inflammatory. The speeches weren't inflammatory, and it was harmless basically. So, but anyway, the police came and they told the crowd to disperse, and then a bomb was thrown. The police opened fire into the crowd. 7 police were killed, and a large number of civilians were killed, perhaps 50. And what happened was the police. What I've read about it is that many of the police were killed by friendly fire because they were just randomly shooting into the crowd. So basically, that's really what happened on the May 4th incident, leading all the things that happened basically. So there was a trial for the anarchists. 8 defendants were tried and 4 were executed, all anarchists. That included Albert Spies. I think, let me get the names correct here. It was Parsons and Spies were both part of that. Were executed. So basically, since then, May Day has been like basically a part of the labor movement, a sort of an event that really people hold as an inspirational thing. And basically that's the background behind it. It really took off. And I guess Liam's going to tell us a little bit more about after, what's happened after that.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for enlightening us on the history of that event and all of the parts that led up to it. Our next guest speaker, as mentioned, is certainly Liam Carbett. He's a first-year teacher at Thomas Jefferson Elementary School in Falls Church, Virginia. He is also on the committee for collective bargaining in his local AFSCME. So welcome, Liam. We are really excited for you to share with us the U.S. history behind May Day and its significance in this labor movement.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me tonight. And thank you for coming out on your Sunday night. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of May 1st. And kind of similar to what David did, I'm going to go back and before Haymarket, give a little bit of context. And
Liam, your speaker notes are showing.
Oh, okay. One sec. Is that better? Hold on one sec. Sorry, guys.
Try it again. There you go.
Is that all right?
There we go. Excellent.
All right. So I'm gonna start off going back into the 1800s and briefly kind of touch on a couple important parts of the labor movement leading up to Haymarket and after the fact as well. And I'll have a little bit of overlap with David. Thank you. That was a really great, comprehensive history of Haymarket, David. So thank you. And so, yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. So, all right. So May 1st has a long and complicated history in the United States, and I'm gonna briefly touch on some of the parts that I thought they were the most important. And just we all thought that this now is the perfect time to discuss the history of May 1st, since it's happening next week. And on this May Day, there's going to be a new struggle being fought by working people in Virginia, the struggle to win collective bargaining rights from public employers. So, all right, thanks again for coming, and looking forward to the discussion at the end. So, the social movement for the 8-hour workday, like David was saying, has always been one of the most central demands of the labor movement early on. And workers have fought very hard to win it from their employers. So negotiating working hours, it's been one of the top priorities of unions in particular. And this struggle is an essential part of the history of May 1st as a celebration of workers around the world. So one of the first worker organizations to agitate for a standard set of working hours was the Philadelphia Carpenters Union. And in 1791, they led the first union strike in building trades in US history. And so their successful protests led to the formation of the first local union, the Federal Society of Journeymen, who would conduct a form of collective bargaining with their employer in 1792, with the 8-hour or the 10-hour workday as a central demand. All right. And so as early as 1836, labor movement publications were calling for an 8-hour workday. And by the 1840s, some unions had actually won it, like the Boston Ship Carpenters did in 1842. And the labor movement was building steam towards the end of the 19th century. And by its end, the 8-hour day was a commonplace expectation in the public sector due to the persistence of union organizations and labor activists. So on June 25th, 1868, Congress passed an 8-hour work law for federal employees, which was to little of no effect. Despite the law passing, owners were able to cut wages by 20% without consequences, which ultimately didn't benefit the workers. So this is pretty reflective, I think, of all major victories for the labor movement in general across US history. And it's that all major victories have come about from workers agitating for change themselves rather than the concessions given to them by their employers or from the state. And so David talked about a lot about this already, so I won't go too in depth, but what does all this 8-hour, the social movement for 8-hour workday have to do with May 1st? Well, as David mentioned, on Haymarket had a lot to do, was mainly precipitated because of protests surrounding the 8-hour workday. And so on that day, 1886, on May 1st, Albert and Lucy Parsons, alongside the Chicago Knights of Labor, they led 80,000 people down Michigan Avenue in Chicago, chanting slogans like 8-hour day, no cut in pay. And so the movement for the 8-hour day has been a unifying issue that all workers can relate to on a universal level. And it's become like a central force uniting workers across different trades and skill sets together in protests of unfair and uninhabitable working conditions imposed upon them by their employers. And so on that day, and on leading up to May Day on May 1st, 1886, that day would become known as the first May Day parade. And in the next few days, they were joined by workers across the country. Over 350,000 people went on strike in over 1,200 factories, and they were all protesting in favor of the 8-hour day. And so since then, May 1st has represented a day of solidarity among workers around the nation and around the world. And it's a celebration of their collective solidarity as workers and their strength in numbers. So this picture is Lucy Parsons, who was also very active alongside Albert Parsons on May 1st and on May 4th. And following the Haymarket affair, she was very active organizing May Day celebrations around the world in Chicago and New York City. She was very influential in the labor movement in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. So following May Day, there were popular marches and protests in the name of labor rights became far more common and more impactful as well. So on May 1st, 1894, unemployed workers organized by Jacob Coxey protested unemployment caused by the Panic of 1893 and to lobby for the government to create jobs which would involve building roads and other public work improvements. This was another public display of protest that showed people the power of organized labor, and it began a long tradition of marches and protests in DC that still happens regularly to this day. In New York City and other major cities around the world, large May Day celebrations were common, and they attracted massive crowds into central locations like Union Square. The rallies were organized by labor activists, unemployed people, specifically unemployed councils, and determined workers fighting for self-determination. So in the late 19th and 20th century, American workers were able to make major wins and secure important conditions such as the 8-hour day on a national level. However, as the labor movement grew stronger, it drew significant repression from owners and employers. And to summarize a couple of the major repressive elements that, towards May Day, one of the biggest ones was more symbolic. Was in 1893, Grover Cleveland announced that the first May Day in September would be known as Labor Day, which we know it today in the US. And it was a symbolic gesture to de-emphasize the connection between May 1st and the international labor movement. So today, Labor Day in September is completely removed from the international working class solidarity movement. It's been pretty much neutralized as a symbol of the labor movement by opponents of labor in the US. Another significant repressive element in the 20th century towards the labor movement was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which was more of a direct attack on the movement. So it restricted activities and repressed the power of labor unions by outlawing jurisdictional strikes, solidarity political strikes, secondary boycotts, mass picketing, closed shops, union donations to political campaigns, and other sources of union power. And so also in the state of Virginia, which is a right to work state, collective bargaining was banned in 1977, which would significantly reduce the leverage of workers in their negotiations with employers about working conditions. So these are just some of the repressive tactics, or few of many of the strategic attempts to repress the power of labor in the US and obscure the significance of working class solidarity. So since the mid 20th century, the labor movement has been in a sharp decline, largely due to the repressive measures of the employers and by the state. So the number of employed union members has declined by 2.9 million since 1983. And during the same time, the number of all wage and salary workers grew from 88.3 to 133.7 million. So currently, Virginia's union membership is one of the lowest in the country at 4.4% of workers unionized. Just as a point of comparison, Virginia has about the same population as New York City, which is the most heavily unionized city in the US. And Virginia has 164,000 union members, while New York City has 695,000. And so it's no coincidence that a sharp rise in income inequality has taken place during the same time as the decline of the power of labor in the US. So this is a graph I found that just, to me, it showed like a direct correlation between this rise of income inequality and the decline of union membership since the mid 20th century. So this red line represents union membership. So we see it taking a sharp increase in the 1920s, like early 20th century, and then taking a sharp decline around mid-century. And at the same time, this is a very like correlative graph showing the share of income going to the top 10% of earners going way up. So it should come as no surprise to us that the repression of unions and the social safety nets that they create leads to a misappropriation of wealth and inequitable distribution of that wealth. The unions exist as a vehicle to make this activity of labor more fair and humane. And they also act as a vehicle to distribute that wealth in a more equitable way than the free market allows. So as union power decreases, income inequality inevitably increases as well. So if we're looking ahead, or looking back briefly, the 8-hour day was an essential fight for workers who came before us to restore dignity and humanity in the workplace. And for us, that essential fight in the labor movement now has to be, especially in Virginia at this moment, has to be for collective bargaining. So it's essential that we have the power as a collective to negotiate with our employers about conditions that affect us on a daily basis. For the last 40 years, unions in Virginia have not had any real leverage to make demands of their employers without being ignored or experiencing backlash. This May Day, workers have the opportunity to change that. So collective bargaining, like I said, is a right in the same way that the 8-hour workday is. You can make a difference in the movement to win back workers' right to self-determination if you can do things like becoming active in your local union and agitating for change based on the issues that you and your fellow workers identify. So after May 1st, 2021, workers in Virginia are going to regain that potential to enter into a new contract with their employers that requires workers' unions to be included in the process of negotiations to make decisions about issues that impact them. Before this, workers were at the mercy of their employer in every decision-making process. So collective bargaining has to be won, though. This is a struggle, and you have to be active at your workplace if you want to see it become a reality. So this May Day is symbolic of a new dawn of the labor movement in the US. On May 1st, Virginia workers have the opportunity to fight for a legitimate seat at the bargaining table with employers and to secure power as a collective unit. So this Saturday, May 1st, we have to remember, let's take it easy, let's take it. All right.
That's great. It's an exciting time. Thank you, Liam, for recapping our struggles and what is ahead as we approach May 1st. It is really exciting. And I agree, you've got to join your union, you have to become active. So thank you for sharing that. Our next guest speaker is Charlotte Mallerich. She's a librarian assistant at the Arlington Public Library and a member and activist with AFSCME Local 3001, as well as an author and member of the National Writers Union. So welcome, Charlotte. Can you give us a better picture of this global aspect of May Day and how our labor movement is still interconnected present day?
Hey, yeah, thank you, Carla. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, David, for giving us the background and the groundwork for that. So what I've got up on your screen right now is I am showing you countries in the world that celebrate May 1st as Labor Day. All those countries in red celebrate May 1st or near May 1st as Labor Day, unlike in the United States, Canada, and Australia. But no matter where you are in the world, if you happen to be in the United States or Canada or Australia, you can still celebrate May Day as a day of workers' power if you're a member of the working class. So don't be afraid to get out and march, find your union, find your collective, and make demands. This is going to be happening all over the world next Saturday, as well as in Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia, Arlington, Virginia, all around us. So why did this day that started as a fight for the 8-hour workday in Chicago become the International Labor Day that it did? So it does go back to the trial of the Haymarket 8 that David laid out. This was recognized not only in the United States, but internationally as a miscarriage of justice, that the 8 anarchist leaders who were tried for inciting a riot on May 4th in 1886 were actually being blamed not because of any particular actions that they took, but because the capitalist class was frightened of what would happen from an organized, coordinated labor movement. To this day, May Day in Mexico is known both as Dia del Trabajo, Labor Day, but also as Dia de los Mártires de Haymarket, because the international press was following what was happening to these folks in Chicago. Following the execution of her husband, Albert Parsons, Lucy Parsons traveled to England where she gave speeches, and she encouraged international labor leaders to make May 1st an international holiday. And then in 1889, the International Socialist Congress, sometimes called the Second International, which is the successor to the first international labor organization in the world. They held a Congress of Delegates in Paris, where they decided that not only was the fight for the 8-hour workday a central demand of the working class, but that May 1st, 1890, the very next May Day, would be a worldwide day of action to get that 8-hour day. And it, in fact, was celebrated in Cuba, Chile, Peru, as well as all those cities in Europe that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. And although there wasn't a May Day celebration held yet in Japan, it was covered in the Japanese press as well as in Australia. In fact, that first May Day went so well and was such a big deal that most labor groups decided to continue and actually make it an annual event. So what happens on May Day? Well, you get strikes, you get marches, you also get outdoor festivals, singing, peasant costumes. You have labor publications issuing demands, there's speeches, and there's historical talks like we just heard from David and Liam. You also get police repression, beatings, arrests, firings, people getting fired from their job, crackdowns on freedom of the press and freedom of assembly, and martial law and curfews imposed. In later years, May 1st became a very popular day for right-wing forces to hold execution of their left-wing opponents. So what May Day has become to this point is a combination of the old peasant holiday, where in the Northern Hemisphere, we used to celebrate the coming of spring, but it's now combined with the labor movement. So we are focusing not only on the demand for the 8-hour day and why that was so central, but there are also other demands that become important to the labor movement. But why did the 8-hour day, why was that like the first thing that so many groups asked for? Not only did it improve the quality of life of workers, because they could go home after 8 hours of working on the job with their full salary, and not after 10, 12, 16 hours, but also because going home and having enough leisure time to become educated, to read newspapers, to get to know their community, to become politically involved. It was hoped that this would also lead to workers making other demands, not only in their workplace for things like health and safety and healthcare, but also to a worldwide perspective of what would be good for the whole working class. What is good for us? What is bad for us? What is a just world? And a way to also coordinate our efforts so that we're not just asking for a different thing in Germany and Panama and Japan, but we're all speaking with one voice, making the similar set of demands. So what is hurting the working class? This became the important thing to think about. By 1907, war appeared on the horizon in Europe. World War I, the possibility of World War I was becoming more and more likely. So the Second International issued a resolution that if war did come, that socialists should try to bring about an end to it as soon as possible, because realizing that the decisions to go to war would be made by a ruling class who never had to experience the consequences of that war directly. It would be the working class who were doing all the fighting and dying and experiencing the casualties and deprivations that would come with the war. So there were a number of resolutions issued to take an anti-war stance by labor organizations. These were followed by anti-war demonstrations in the United States and Europe on May Day in 1912, and from that year all the way through the years of World War I. In Germany, the Social Democrats, the major socialist party, turned their back on the demands of the working class for an opposition to the war, and with only one exception, actually voted for Germany to go to the war with the rest of the world. At the same time, a group formed in Germany called the Spartacus League, which was named after the leader of the largest slave revolt in Rome, in ancient Rome. And they started issuing demands for people to come out and demonstrate on May Day, and called for an immediate end to the war, and urged soldiers of every nation to turn their guns around on the upper classes who were exploiting them, rather than shooting their working class siblings in other nations. By February of 1917, the Russian army had so many losses and casualties in World War I that the soldiers were ready to revolt, and this brought about the Revolution of February, which ended the monarchy there in Russia. And then May Day 1917, it was a huge celebration, which included the demand to end the war and to bring about peace. followed up in October 1917 with the formation of the Soviet Union, fulfilling that, that earlier suggestion from the Spartacus League that the workers should turn the guns around on the classes that were exploiting them. Despite the fact that there was a government prohibition of any kind of meeting or procession, following World War I, the first May Day in Paris had large march calling for disarmament and the non-intervention of France in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Similarly, there were calls in London for the UK to stay out of Russian affairs, and also calling for the British to remove their troops from Ireland and India and recognize the right of Irish and Indian people to self-govern. So their May Day resolution in 1920 called on workers of all countries to refuse to provide munitions of war or the means of intervention by British or other capitalist governments. Similarly, in Tokyo in 1927, there was a resolution for the 8-hour workday and for workers' compensation, the formation of a nationwide labor union, as well as to keep Japan from intervening in China, which was currently in the midst of a civil war. In China itself, trade unionists in Hankow distributed handbills appealing to US and British sailors to refuse to fire on Chinese workers. You sailors on the warships come from the working class and should join us in union demands. Although your warships threaten the lives of our people, we workers and peasants greet you as class brothers. Would you kill us for this? By 1933, the Nazi Party had risen to power in Germany. At that point, the Spartacus League had become the German Communist Party, and they warned that a Second World War was coming. But when it comes to fascism, most labor organizations are not pacifists, are not anti-war. And you would see this pattern throughout the 1930s and the 1940s, which a fascist government would rise to power, co-opt or outlaw May 1st as May Day, and suppress communists and labor organizations, along with others who they labeled outsiders, religious and ethnic minorities. In Germany, the Nazis turned May 1st into a festival day of labor and eliminated the class distinction. Instead, they turned it into a nationalist day in which every German of every class should be celebrating. Right after the first of these festivals, they outlawed independent trade unions and seized union assets. Japan, Italy, and Spain saw similar developments. But May 1st remained a day of resistance for organizers. For example, in Belgium in 1933, May Day marchers went to the German consulate and tore down the Nazi flag. During World War I, in Allied countries, the United States and the UK, rather than urging workers to go on strike on May Day, labor organizers asked workers to remain at work and to support the war effort against fascist governments. In 1944, in Buchenwald concentration camp, members of the outlawed Communist Party secretly met with others to sing a workers' song, to listen to speeches, and they handwrote their May Day leaflet calling for an end to the war and freedom from fascism. In 1945, the Soviets took over Berlin from the Nazis. They removed the swastika from the Reichstag, the government building in Berlin, and raised the hammer and sickle instead to signal the end of fascism in Germany. But following World War II, you still had fascism in other parts of the world, and you continue to see this throughout the 20th century. So for example, in Chile, when Pinochet took over, there was a large May Day demonstration this is 1984, against the Pinochet government. After World War II, calls for peace and non-intervention and working class solidarity continued, with an additional emphasis on ending imperialism and colonialism and pushing for self-determination for workers in every part of the globe. Chinese May Days, for example, called for a ban on atomic weapons, an armistice in Korea, and for peaceful coexistence among countries with different social systems. In France, North African immigrants started demonstrating for the freedom of Algeria from French colonialism. Similarly, in May Day 1956, New Age, which was a publication of the Communist Party of South Africa, issued their challenge: "We shall demand, with all the strength we have, the right to govern ourselves, knowing that workers cannot achieve economic security until they have gained political freedom." In '66, you had Vietnamese people in Saigon demonstrating at the US Embassy to get the US out. In '61, 3,000 Cubans walked off the job at the Guantanamo Naval Base to protest the Bay of Pigs invasion, and so on. The labor movement has always had to address the particular ways that Black workers and other workers of color are controlled and oppressed. Going back to Lucy Parsons, who was the daughter of an enslaved African woman. In the 1930s, for example, May Day demonstrations frequently called for the release of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 young Black men who were spuriously accused of raping white women, and an end to police brutality, and so on. The very first May Day that was celebrated in South Africa was in 1895, but at first, labor organizations in South Africa excluded Black workers until the South Africa Communist Party started organizing Black workers and white workers together in 1928. When apartheid, the legal separation of the races, was codified in 1950, both the Communist Party and the African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, called for a general strike on May 1st. This caused the government to ban public gatherings from April 30th to May 3rd, but nevertheless, folks went out and demonstrated anyway. 9 Black workers were killed in Johannesburg by police that year. But strikes continue to be a protest tactic against the apartheid government. There's a formation of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, that's COSATU, which you can see in the upper left. Was a federation of unions, workers of all races, and their platform included a minimum wage, equal pay for men and women, and the legal right to strike, as well as opposing apartheid. There were major strikes in 1986 and 1988 against apartheid, supported around the world by labor organizations, including one of the unions that I belong to, AFSCME. And you can see AFSCME's former Treasurer Secretary, Bill Lucey, here in this demonstration against apartheid in Washington. And I think this is '85. You can also see Jesse Jackson over here. And that's Bill Lucey again here, with the president of the National Educators Association here, Mary Futrell. So with the worldwide support of labor, the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, and COSATU were able to organize the end of apartheid in the 90s, leading up to the first multiracial elections in 1994, and the institution of May Day as a national holiday in South Africa in 1995. And that is the power of international solidarity, because no matter which side of the imaginary line you were born on, if you are a working class person, you have some things in common with other working class people. And we also share a common form of power, which is that we make stuff work. We drive the buses, we repair the roads, we teach the kids. So when we organize together, we can actually shut things down and make change. And then I just want to say a quick thank you to the folks who helped me find pictures and information.
Wow, thank you so much, Charlotte. Learned a lot from all three of our guest speakers. So round of applause to each of you. Thank you so much for doing the research and bringing this to this webinar tonight. We are really grateful. We do have some opportunities. One of the things, join your union. I kept on hearing it in each of the kind of presentations, right? It's so important. We need to change that graph that Liam shared so that it's reversed. So we want that union membership back to the top. So if you're a worker in Alexandria City or Arlington, you have your AFSCME local, make sure you check out their website and join them. They do have a training coming up on May 1st from 10 to 12:30, as you see there. If you're an education professional like Liam and myself, please join our union as well. The Virginia Education Association is headquartered right in Richmond, Virginia. So we have the link there. If you don't know where your local is, please reach out and join it. We do have an Organized to Bargain conference for our union members coming up on May 1st as well from 9 to 3:30. And we'll do some pre-celebrating the evening before with our union members. So we're really excited to see some of them in this room right now as well. So at this time, once again, thank you to all of our guest speakers for sharing your insights this evening. And at this time, we will open it up for a discussion. And if we had any questions from our audience who has joined us. So if you would just raise your hand and we can identify you, and then we'll let you unmute to ask your question. And the raised hand feature should be there when you see your name. If you pull up the participants list, there we go. Jeff Elkner, go ahead and unmute.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you all for doing this presentation. It's so important for us to claim back our history, and what a wonderful presentation it was. I just wanted to send a shout out to y'all and thank you for doing this.
And thank you for being here. Do we have any other questions for any of our presenters? Some of the information that they had shared, things you wanted clarified? I don't know about you, but I'm pretty excited to make history here in Virginia come this May 1st. And I would really like to see Charlotte, us out in the streets, having parades again and showing our union pride together. So maybe we can start brainstorming. I know that there are several activities and events that are taking place online this year, but we can always start planning ahead for the future.
And I will say, for anybody who has already been vaccinated or feels comfortable doing something in person, Karen put in the chat, there is a May Day march starting at gathering at 2 p.m. in Malcolm X Park in DC, and then the march will head off at 3. I know my folks in the Progressive Labor Party and the IWW will be there.
Yes, thank you for catching that in the chat. I did make a note of that, but thank you for making sure we all noticed it and see that opportunity. Yay, Louise, go. Yes, we certainly need to plan our next event. Any other questions or items that you'd like to share in the room since we're together? Go ahead, Jeanette. I see your hand raised.
Yeah, there's also, in addition to the VEA May Day rally, there's also, which is virtual, there's also going to be a May Day ProAct rally in Old Town, Virginia, for those who do want to show up in person. And this is to pressure Senator Mark Warner to co-sponsor and vote yes on the PRO Act, which would be the most important piece of labor most important labor bill we would have since the New Deal. So it's really important that that gets passed so we can get repeal right to work, and so that we can protect the right to organize. So it's easier to join unions. So it's easier to form unions in the private sector. So I just put that in the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I see FEA President Kimberly Adams is here, and she placed in the chat our rally day right before May Day. So thank you for sharing that information as well. Did you want to say anything to get everyone excited?
Yeah, I'm not the rallying type right now. I'm trying to finish off 500 things on a Sunday before Monday hits. But yeah, go fight, win. And this is what we're going to do. We're just going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing until we get everything we need. So proud of the folks in Alexandria for all the work they did to get their bargaining ordinance written as best it could be. And now we need to bring it to Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, and everywhere else in the Commonwealth. So let's go.
Absolutely. Stronger together. All right. And I see Virginia Diamond is in the room. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to share that we might have missed.
No, I just want to compliment the presenters. That was a fantastic program. I really, really enjoyed it. So you guys did great. And I know that you got that. I'm in Arlington, so we're going to get our ordinance real soon, I hope, and get the bargaining going. So wonderful to see you all. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you. Well, it is 6:30. If we don't have any other questions, we hope that you'll enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening so that you get rejuvenated for the work week ahead. Once again, join your union, get your coworkers to join the union, become active if you're not already active, and we're going to celebrate our worker power, and we are going to get into the streets, hopefully next year, if you're not already going to do it this year or online. So we will see you then. Go fight, win.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you all for joining us.